Hi everybody, thanks for coming out today to see my performance of the journey of popular music and its impacts, which it's had upon our culture. In this presentation, I will be discussing the impact of swing. No, not the music that plays in your head when you see an outdated infomercial from the 1960s of a woman in the kitchen cooking food for her man, but the playing ground of the equally outcast, ahead of their time, instigators of big band swing. Be prepared to give this your full attention and dedicated time as we explore the events during the 1930s and the 1940s that helped shape big band swing. We will follow the likes of Fletcher Henderson, Benny Goodman, and Glenn Miller, understanding and analysing how these musicians helped influence and develop popular music during the Great Depression. We will swing through time and see how the popularisation of radio allowed American culture to grow, spread, and thrive. We'll take a trip to Germany and hear their side of the story, find out how swing music was received and its influence on the populace of the Nazi regime, particularly the youth of Germany. Now, before we get into the swing of things, we have to know the origins. Where did it all begin? After World War I, blacks and whites lived very different, segregated lives, which meant not reading the same literature, attending the same schools, or indeed listening to the same music. Whilst white people listened to smooth jazz, influenced more by classical music, African Americans were developing music from their own roots, as well as the more improvised jazz from New Orleans and Chicago. Swing was prominent in Harlem, New York, where African Americans from all over the country had populated in the 20s, men like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Fletcher Henderson. Due to the popularity of swing in Harlem, black jazz bands were soon playing in segregated clubs where whites attended. Swing was soon to become a multiracial genre, an important common ground for Americans during times of prejudice and racism. Now, swing had been around for a decade before, but it was brought into the mainstream by Benny Goodman, a virtuoso clarinetist. When the stock market crash of 1929 occurred, it quickly became difficult for many bands to find work, with only the best bands performing. While Duke Ellington's orchestra toured Europe, Fletcher Henderson was struggling to make cash and turned to selling his arrangements, where he sold many to Goodman. Goodman was the first band leader to perform with a mixed-race orchestra, and with Henderson's upbeat, syncopated arrangements combined with Goodman's interest with classical music, started to bring the two cultures closer together. Goodman's band performed regularly on the NBC radio show Let's Dance, which was broadcast from New York City. His band wouldn't play until the early hours of the morning on the East Coast, meaning a smaller audience to listen to the innovative arrangements provided by Henderson. However, Let's Dance was broadcast across the states, meaning that the rest of the country would be listening at an earlier, more appropriate time. Since the invention of radio in 1895, its development has meant that news and entertainment can be broadcasted all over the country at the same time. And this was all the better for Goodman, and in a way, all the better for the entire nation as well. New York became the home of Radio City in 1932 when plans for a Metropolitan Opera House fell through, and it was decided that they would build the Rockefeller Center. New York became the capital for radio and mass communications. No wonder it was so popular. Consumers were transported to another world when they tuned in, taking them to nightclubs, hotels and bars filled with music. After a catastrophic tour with his band around the United States, Goodman's concert in the Palomar Ballroom on August 21st, 1935, began a series of events which led a nationwide craving for swing, which later became a cornerstone of American youth culture. Swing music was the beginning of the end of depression that spanned over the United States and Europe, signifying better days to come. The new swing dances created in New York City quickly spread and took the West by storm. However, as we know now, the late 30s and 40s weren't the greatest of times either. Glenn Miller, another jazz musician who had been organising bands and arranging music, created his own big band to bring music to the masses. After a successful civilian career and performing on a number of radio broadcasts, Miller set along a new path that involved joining the army in 1942, his eyes set on boosting the morale of American soldiers. Miller and his band kept spirits high as they toured and performed on dozens of radio broadcasts. His weekly appearance on I Sustained the Wings brought many new recruits into the Air Force. Benny Goodman didn't just light the spark of swing in the States, but he also did it in Germany. Due to the First World War, there were many restrictions on foreign music, and thus it wasn't until 1919 that jazz came to Germany. While 1920s Germany embraced modernism, Adolf Hitler despised it. Jazz was outlawed across the country as it was seen as non-Aryan since its roots came from African Americans and was performed by Jews. Benny Goodman was an example of the many Jewish jazz musicians. When Hitler disbanded all youth groups to create his Hitler Youth, many young Germans were dead set against becoming indoctrinated by the Nazi regime. Swing kids, or Swingjugend, embraced individualism and foreign culture, whereas the uniform Hitler Youth were being taught how to be German. Swing youth could be identified by their fancy haircuts, bohemian-style clothing, and dancing to what the Nazis called dangerous music. In addition, girls applied generous amounts of lipstick and nail polish, which went against the Nazis' image of natural beauty for German women. The government punished everyone who did not conform. Some boys had their heads shaved, many offenders were placed in factories to work, and some were sent to concentration camps. Swing music is regarded as the first variant of pop music, with some individuals claiming that the genre was more about selling to the masses than making music. But why did it take so long for swing music to be recognised and embraced by the public? Remember that this was the early 20th century and segregation was still prominent. Jazz itself was created in New Orleans by African Americans, and the genre quickly became a music of protest against discrimination. The innovations by black musicians were swept under the rug by prejudice and racism. Benny Goodman was famous for being colorblind, in which he did not care whether one was black or white, and Goodman's national fame allowed mixed racial groups to be more widely accepted, and even then, it was still difficult for black musicians to be recognized. Throughout the 30s, African Americans were in the background and thus received very little exposure in newspapers and magazines compared to their Caucasian counterparts. Furthermore, when the Second World War began, many musicians were drafted into the military, and although some bands still made a living during the war, many bands had to disband due to a number of reasons, including financial issues and lack of membership. Big band swing helped build the foundations of youth culture in America and the rest of Europe. It was an innovation to modern music like nothing the world had seen. Even fascists and totalitarian governments couldn't hold back the counterculture of the swing youth because the music was too powerful. Swing kept Allied soldiers' heads high, and together with the power of radio and mass communication across the Atlantic, brought more men to the call of war. As the Second World War raged on, the swing era slowly came to a close.